Top 1. The Sandbyborg Massacre. The Sandbyborg Massacre took place on the Swedish island of Öland. The walls of this 5th century ring fort did not collapse due to the ravages of war. Instead, they fell because of a haunting silence. No one was left to maintain them. When archaeologists first began excavating the site known as Sandbyborg, they anticipated finding the typical remnants of an Iron Age settlement. What they discovered instead was something that no existing framework in forensic archaeology had prepared them for. They found a skeleton lying on the floor of a house, unburied and undisturbed. Then they found another, and then another. In total, 26 bodies were discovered, distributed across the interior of a ring fort that had simply been sealed and abandoned. Everything was left exactly as it was on the night that everything ended. The bodies showed absolutely no signs of burial rituals. There was no post-mortem arrangement and no attempt at recovery. The victims remained exactly where they fell. Blade wounds were clearly marked on the bones. There was blunt force trauma consistent with the use of clubs and axes, as well as sharp-edged cuts consistent with swords delivered at close range. This violence was not random. It was efficient, targeted, and absolute. Every person inside Sandbyborg was killed, and not a single person survived to bury the dead. Inside one of the excavated houses, a half-eaten fish was discovered beside a body. The meal had never been finished. Whatever arrived that night struck without any warning. There was no time to stand, no time to flee, and no time to mount a coordinated defense. That fish remained on the floor for 15 centuries before anyone saw it again. Among the remains, archaeologists recovered gold and silver coins, rings and jewelry of significant value. None of these items had been taken. This evidence rules out robbery as a motive with near certainty. Whoever carried out the massacre at Sandbyborg did not want valuables. They wanted the people inside dead, and they wanted the fort left exactly as it was, a deliberate abandonment and a monument to something dark. After the killings, the gates were closed and the bodies were left inside. The surrounding community, or whatever remained of it, never re-entered for reasons that have never been explained. No one came back to collect the deceased. No neighboring settlement attempted a burial, and no record from that period references the event. An entire community was erased, and the world around it simply moved on. Isotope analysis of the skeletal remains revealed that some of the victims were not local. They had traveled to Sandbyborg from elsewhere, possibly as guests or as residents who had relocated. Their presence raises questions that only deepen the mystery. Was this a targeted political execution, a tribal annihilation, or a coordinated act of revenge against a specific group? Every theory requires evidence that simply does not exist. No attacker has ever been identified, no motive has ever been confirmed, and no account from any surviving contemporary source describes the event. The ring fort stood silent for over 1,000 years before the bones were found. Those bones have told us everything except the one thing that truly matters. Who came through the gates that night, and why did they leave everything behind except the dead? Top 2. The Pangayasidi Cave. At Pangayasidi on the Kenyan coast, buried beneath layers of forest soil and collapsed sediment, there is a cave that human beings never stopped using. It wasn't just for a generation or a century, it was for 78,000 years. When archaeologists began excavating the Pangayasidi cave network in Kilifi County, Kenya, they were not expecting to find a continuous record of human occupation, stretching from the Middle Stone Age to near modern times. What they uncovered was not a single settlement or a buried campsite. It was an unbroken thread of human presence, running across more than 300 generations, layered into the earth with the precision of a geological record. No other site in sub-Saharan Africa has produced evidence of continuous habitation on this scale. The main chamber of the cave network spans over 1,000 square feet. Michael Petralia, director of the Australian Research Centre for Human Evolution, confirmed that the space was large enough to have housed hundreds of people at a time. It was not a temporary shelter or a seasonal refuge. It was a home returned to again and again by people who had no written language, no maps, and no way of knowing that the generations before them had stood in the same darkness and made the same fires. The earliest artifacts recovered from the deepest excavation layers date to approximately 78,000 years ago. These were large, relatively unrefined stone tools, the kind associated with early Middle Stone Age populations, navigating an uncertain and often hostile continent. Then something changed. Around 67,000 years ago, the tool assemblage shifted. Smaller, more specialized arrowheads and blades began appearing in the layers. The people using this cave were not the same people who had first entered it. They were more refined, more deliberate, and more technically sophisticated. The cave had outlasted entire evolutionary leaps in human cognition and survived to record all of them. What kept people returning across such an incomprehensible span of time comes down to one factor that archaeology rarely gets to measure directly: climate stability. While vast regions of Africa endured repeated cycles of drought, desertification, and ecological collapse, the tropical forests surrounding Pangaea Saidi maintained a relatively consistent environment. Water sources held and vegetation persisted. The forest did not abandon this corner of Kenya, and so the people did not abandon the cave. This matters because it reframes how we understand human survival during the most volatile periods of prehistoric climate change. When the continent fractured into uninhabitable zones, there were pockets of stability. Pangaea Saidi was one of them, a refuge preserved by geography, returned to by necessity, and slowly transformed from a shelter into something closer to a cultural anchor. 78,000 years of continuous human presence means that this cave witnessed the entire arc of what we call prehistory. It was occupied before Homo sapiens had even left Africa, and it was still being used after they had spread across every continent on Earth. The people who first entered Pangaea Saidi could not have imagined us, and yet the same walls held them. The same dark interior absorbed their fires, their tools, their dead, and their children. Whatever drove human beings back to this cave across an unimaginable stretch of time was not recorded in any language. It is recorded only in the layers of Earth that archaeologists are still carefully and methodically removing. Each layer contains a version of us that we no longer recognize. Top 3. The Hierakonpolis Animal Zoo. 5,000 years ago, before the first stone of any pyramid was cut and before the great monuments of Egypt had even been imagined, a town on the western bank of the Nile was already keeping elephants. Hierakonpolis was among the most powerful urban centers of pre-dynastic Egypt. It was not a mere village. It was a place of administration, ritual, and wealth, a settlement large enough and organized enough to sustain a class of elite residents whose appetite for status extended beyond gold and land into something far more deliberate. They kept wild animals not as livestock or food sources, but as symbols of dominance over the natural world. These were living displays of power maintained within the boundaries of a civilization that was still learning what civilization meant. When archaeologists excavated the animal cemetery at Hierakonpolis, the inventory was not what anyone expected from a 5,000-year-old site. They found 2 elephants, multiple baboons, a hippopotamus, wildcats, dogs, and other exotic species buried in a dedicated area that indicated intentional disposal rather than accidental accumulation. The sheer variety of the collection pointed to something organized and sustained. These animals had not simply wandered into the settlement and died. They had been obtained, transported, and kept alive. Then the bones began to tell a more complicated story. Several of the baboon skeletons showed evidence of healed fractures, not fresh breaks or injuries sustained at the moment of death, but old wounds that had closed and calcified over time. The hippopotamus showed the same pattern. These were fractures consistent with violent capture, the stress of physical restraint, and the trauma of being taken from a wild environment and forced into confinement. These were injuries that would have been lethal without human intervention. Bones do not heal in the wild when predators are present and movement is compromised. They heal in controlled environments where the animal is protected, fed, and kept stationary long enough for the body to repair itself. This is how archaeologists know these animals were not simply caught and displayed briefly before dying. They were maintained and cared for in a functional sense, if not necessarily a compassionate one. Keepers would have monitored their conditions, managed their injuries, and ensured their survival because a dead exotic animal held no status value. The investment was too significant to allow the animals to perish from neglect. What this reveals about pre-dynastic Egypt is difficult to overstate. The infrastructure required to capture a wild elephant, transport it along the Nile, house it within an urban settlement, And keep it alive long enough for its fractures to heal completely was not simple. It demanded resources, specialized knowledge, and a social structure capable of supporting what was, in every functional sense, the earliest documented zoo in human history. The animals buried at Hierakonpolis lived confined lives far from the environments that produced them. Their bones recorded that confinement with forensic precision. Every healed fracture is a document of captivity, a record of the exact moment when human ambition decided that the wild world could be owned, displayed, and controlled. That instinct did not begin with Rome or with Renaissance menageries. It began here in the dust of a pre-dynastic Egyptian town, 5 centuries before anyone thought to build a pyramid. Top 4. The Vampire Child of Poland. In a 17th century cemetery in Pien, Poland, archaeologists uncovered a child buried face down in the earth with a padlock fastened around its foot. The lock was triangular and functional, not decorative. Someone had placed it there deliberately with the intention of keeping something inside the ground. The burial was discovered in 2022 during excavations led by Professor Dariusz Polinsky of Nicolaus Copernicus University. The child was between 9 and 10 years old at the time of death. The face-down position was not an accidental misplacement or the result of post-mortem soil movement. It was a deliberate burial orientation that appears consistently across Eastern European archaeological sites associated with individuals whom communities feared might return from the dead. Turning the body face down was a practical measure rooted in specific folk beliefs. If the corpse attempted to rise, it would dig downward, away from the surface and the living. The padlock on the foot reinforced this intention beyond any reasonable doubt. In the vampire folklore traditions of 17th century Poland, iron and locks carried immense symbolic and spiritual weight. They were binding instruments capable of restraining not just the physical body, but the animating force believed to persist within it after death. The triangular shape of this particular lock held additional significance within regional superstition, being a geometry associated with containment and finality. Someone had not simply buried this child, they had imprisoned it. What makes this discovery forensically unsettling is not the folklore, but the question of what this child had done or what had happened to it to warrant such treatment from its own community. Vampire burials in this period were not applied arbitrarily. They were reserved for individuals who died under circumstances considered spiritually dangerous, such as suicide, sudden unexplained death, or deaths preceded by illnesses that spread to others. It also applied to children who died before baptism. The community's decision to bury this child with restraints suggests they believed with complete sincerity that leaving it unbound posed a genuine threat to the living. Alongside the padlock, excavators found a silk cap resting near the child's head. Silk in 17th century rural Poland was not a common material. It was expensive and reserved for individuals of elevated social standing. The presence of the cap introduces a contradiction that has not been resolved. This was not a child from the margins of society. This was a child whose family had means. And yet the community or the family itself chose to bury it with the same precautions applied to the most feared of the restless dead. No cause of death has been determined. The skeletal remains showed no obvious trauma or signs of disease visible in the bone record, and there is no indication of why this child died at such a young age. The circumstances that led the living to fear the dead remain completely unknown. What was buried in Pien was a child, but what the people who buried it believed they were containing was something else entirely. The padlock was still fastened when archaeologists found it. Whatever they were afraid of, they made sure it stayed down, and for nearly 400 years it did. Top 5. The Range Creek Ruins. For decades, a rancher in central Utah drove past ancient pit houses, prehistoric rock paintings, stone tool caches, and carved cliff markings every single day. Yet he said nothing to anyone. When visitors approached the gate at the edge of his 4,000-acre property along Range Creek, they found it locked. The signs read, "Road Closed." They turned around, and the secrets behind those gates remained exactly where a civilization had left them 1,000 years ago. Waldo Wilcox had inherited the ranch from his father, and with it, an unspoken agreement that what existed on that land was not for the outside world. The artifacts scattered across the Range Creek Canyon were not just a footnote to the property, they were embedded throughout it. There were pit houses dug into hillsides, rock art painted and carved onto canyon walls, and prehistoric alignment lines etched into the terrain. Stone tools were left in positions so undisturbed that archaeologists would later describe the site as a time capsule of almost unparalleled preservation. The Wilcox family had known about all of it for generations and had chosen consistently and deliberately to say nothing. The people who left these remnants behind were the Fremont, a distinct prehistoric culture that occupied the Colorado Plateau in the Great Basin from approximately 400 CE to 1300 CE. The Fremont are not well understood. Unlike the ancestral Puebloans to their south, they did not leave behind large architectural complexes easily visible from a distance. They built smaller, more dispersed settlements, stored food in elevated granaries tucked into cliff faces, and produced a rock art tradition that remains only partially interpreted. They disappeared from the archaeological record around the 13th century, and the reasons for their departure have never been conclusively established. What Wilcox had been quietly protecting was one of the most intact Fremont archaeological landscapes ever documented. The isolation of Range Creek Canyon, accessible only through private land, had shielded the site from artifact hunting, vandalism, and the casual destruction that had compromised nearly every other comparable site in the region. No collectors had removed the tools, no graffiti covered the rock art, and no amateur excavations had disturbed the pit house floors. The land had functioned as an accidental preserve, maintained by locked gates and a family's silence. When Wilcox reached an age where managing 4,000 acres was no longer viable, he sold the property to the Utah Bureau of Land Management. The sale price was reported to be significantly below market value. Archaeologists who gained access to the site for the first time described their initial surveys as overwhelming. The density of undisturbed material across the canyon was unlike anything most of them had encountered in the American West. The site is now managed under the oversight of the Utah Museum of Natural History, with access carefully controlled to prevent damage. One family's silence preserved what a century of archaeology could not. The Fremont left Range Creek and never came back. And while the reasons remain unknown, their tools, images, and structures waited in a locked canyon until a rancher finally decided it was time for someone else to hold the key. Top 6. The Sunghir Royal Burial. 34,000 years ago, somewhere east of what is now Moscow, 2 children were placed into the earth with more care, more ceremony, and more material wealth than almost any burial archaeologists have ever uncovered from the Paleolithic period. They were 10 and 12 years old, and both showed signs of physical disability. Whoever buried them wanted the world to know that these children mattered in ways that ordinary death could not diminish. The site is called Sunghir. It was excavated by Soviet archaeologists beginning in the 1950s and has remained one of the most studied and debated prehistoric burial sites in the world. The graves date to approximately 34,000 years ago, placing them firmly within the Upper Paleolithic, a period when modern humans were still navigating an Ice Age landscape alongside megafauna, operating without agriculture, permanent settlements, or institutional structures. And yet, what was found in those graves suggested something that should not have existed at that point in human development: a social system sophisticated enough to bury its children like kings. The 2 adolescent boys were interred head-to-head, their skulls positioned adjacent to one another. Surrounding and covering them was an inventory of grave goods that takes considerable time to process fully. There were 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, which had been sewn into clothing, covering the bodies from head to foot. Researchers estimate it would have taken an individual working continuously approximately 10,000 hours to produce these garments. There were also more than 20 armbands carved from mammoth ivory, nearly 300 pierced fox teeth, and 16 ivory spears, some of which were so long they were impractical as functional weapons, suggesting they were made specifically for the grave. There were carvings, antlers, and across the chest of each child, human fibulae, leg bones from another individual placed with deliberate and unexplained intention. The adults buried at Sunghir during the same period had almost none of this, only a handful of beads and basic tools. The contrast was not subtle. The children had been given everything, while the adults had been given very little. This inversion of what we expect from hierarchical burial traditions has driven decades of academic debate with no consensus explanation. The disability element deepens the mystery considerably. One of the boys showed skeletal evidence of a condition affecting the curvature of his femurs, suggesting he would have walked with difficulty and likely could not have participated in the physical demands of hunter-gatherer life. In a subsistence society where survival depended on mobility and hunting capacity, this child would have required sustained care from others simply to survive into adolescence. He was not a productive member of the group in any conventional economic sense, and yet he was buried with more wealth than anyone else at the site. This tells us something about the people of Sung here that pure survival theory cannot accommodate. They were not simply managing resources and eliminating burdens. They were making choices rooted in something more abstract, like social value, symbolic status, or inherited identity. These children were not buried like royalty because of what they had done, but because of what they represented. What that was, no one has yet been able to determine with certainty. Top 7. The Terracotta Army. In the spring of 1974, farmers digging a well outside the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province struck something hard beneath the dry earth. What they pulled from the ground was the fragment of a clay head, life-size, detailed, and unlike anything they recognized. They reported it, archaeologists arrived, and what followed was the gradual uncovering of one of the most staggering archaeological discoveries in recorded human history. A buried army of 8,000 soldiers that had been standing in formation underground for more than 2,000 years, waiting for an emperor who never came back to lead them. The Terracotta Army was commissioned by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who took the throne in 246 BCE at the age of 13. He spent the decades that followed consolidating power through military force, administrative standardization, and an absolute intolerance for anything that threatened his authority. He also spent those decades preparing for death with the same systematic intensity. Construction of his mausoleum complex began the same year he assumed power and would continue for 38 years, employing an estimated 700,000 workers. What those workers produced was not a tomb in any conventional sense. It was a parallel empire built underground, designed to replicate in death everything Qin Shi Huang had controlled in life. The 8,000 clay warriors are not identical figures mass-produced from a single mold. Each face is individual, and each expression is distinct. Researchers have identified variations in facial structure, hairstyle, armor configuration, and rank insignia that suggest the sculptors were working from real soldiers as references, producing portraits rather than symbols. The warriors were originally painted in vivid pigments, and their weapons were real bronze and iron, functional and sharp, placed in their hands as though the army might be called to attention at any moment. The horses are full-sized, and the chariots are constructed with technical accuracy. Officers stand at the rear of formations, while infantry fill the front lines. The organizational logic of a functioning military unit was replicated in clay across 3 excavated pits, covering an area the size of several football fields. A 4th pit was found empty, interpreted by some as a command headquarters that was never staffed, perhaps because the emperor died before the project reached completion. At the center of the complex, beneath a man-made hill that has never been opened, lies the tomb of Qin Shi Huang himself. Ancient records describe rivers of mercury flowing through a scale model of his empire, with pearls embedded in the ceiling to represent stars and mechanical crossbows rigged to fire at intruders. Soil samples taken from the mound have confirmed abnormally high concentrations of mercury, lending the ancient accounts a credibility that archaeologists treat with both caution and fascination. The tomb has not been excavated due to concerns about structural instability, atmospheric exposure, damaging contents, and technological limitations. Peripheral excavations have uncovered bronze birds, musicians, and figures of acrobats and dancers, suggesting an interior design for an eternal court. The emperor built everything he needed for a reign without end, and the ground above him has not moved in over 2,000 years. Top 8. The Atacama Skeleton Mystery. In 2003, in the driest desert on Earth, someone found a mummified body the size of a human hand. It was only 6 inches long, had an elongated cone-shaped skull, and ribs thinner than toothpicks. Its bones were dense, hardened, and fully formed in ways that defied the size of the body containing them. When photographs circulated, the immediate public response was not archaeological curiosity, but something more visceral. People looked at the Atacama skeleton and saw something that did not belong to this world. The specimen was discovered in a deserted Chilean mining town called La Noria in the Atacama Desert region of northern Chile. It was found wrapped in a cloth, tucked behind an abandoned church, naturally mummified by the extreme aridity of the environment. It was acquired by a Spanish businessman and spent years in private hands before researchers gained access to it for serious scientific study. By that point, the alien theory had already embedded itself deeply into public consciousness. The pointed skull, the enormous eye sockets, and the impossibly small frame all fed a narrative that conventional biology could not easily counter. Scientists named her Ata. DNA sequencing confirmed she was human, unambiguously, entirely, and without qualification, human. Her genetic profile aligned most closely with indigenous Chilean populations with some European ancestry, indicating a mixed heritage consistent with post-colonial population patterns. She was not extraterrestrial. She was a girl born in northern Chile who died in circumstances that have never been fully established. What the DNA could not immediately explain was everything else. Her bone density was consistent with that of a 6-year-old child, despite her total length of 6 inches. Bones reach that level of density through years of development, and a fetus or premature infant does not have bones like hers. This created a biological paradox that took years of additional research to address. How does a body measuring 6 inches accumulate 6 years' worth of skeletal development? Researchers identified 7 distinct genetic mutations in Ada's genome, all associated with skeletal growth and development. These mutations affect the systems that regulate bone formation, cell growth, and structural organization. The specific combination present in her genome was unlike anything previously documented in medical literature. Each mutation individually was known to cause skeletal abnormalities, but the simultaneous presence of all 7 in a single individual produced something that had no clinical precedent. Whether she was stillborn, lived briefly, or survived for some period after birth has not been conclusively determined. The cause of her death remains unknown, and the reason she was wrapped in cloth and left behind a church wall has never been explained. What science has established is this: Ada was human, she was female, and she was genetically connected to the land where she was found. Her body expressed a constellation of mutations that generated a skeleton the medical community had never encountered before. The desert preserved her with extraordinary completeness, but everything about her is documented except the answers. The questions her 6-inch frame continues to generate have not diminished in the 2 decades since she was found. Top 9. The Chiribaya Pet Cemetery. 1,000 years ago on the southern coast of what is now Peru, a community buried its dead with the same care and ceremony extended to any member of the group. Some of those graves contained blankets, food offerings, and carefully arranged personal items. Some of them held dogs. Peruvian anthropologist Sonia Guillen was leading excavations at a cemetery belonging to the Chiribaya culture, a pre-Inca civilization that flourished between approximately 900 and 1350 CE. The Chiribaya were a sophisticated society with developed agricultural and herding practices, distinctive ceramic traditions, and burial customs that reflected complex beliefs about death and identity. Guillen's team was prepared for human remains, but they were not prepared for 43 dogs. The animals had been buried in separate plots positioned near their human owners. This was not accidental proximity. The spatial relationship between the human graves and the dog graves was deliberate, mirroring in death the relationships that had existed in life. The dogs had been interred individually, each in its own dedicated space, with the kind of intentionality reserved for beings whose loss was considered significant. Many of the dogs were buried with food, and some had blankets wrapped around them. These were not symbolic gestures performed hastily. They were considered provisions, the same category of grave goods placed with human dead to sustain them in whatever existed beyond death. The Chiribaya were not disposing of animals. They were burying companions. The functional role these dogs played was documented alongside their burial treatment. They were herding animals used specifically to manage llama flocks across the difficult terrain of the coastal desert. Llamas were central to Chiribai economic life, and a dog capable of managing a llama herd was a working partner whose contribution to the community's survival was direct and measurable. The burials reflect an understanding of that contribution that extended beyond utility into reciprocal obligation. What the desert did to the bodies transformed the archaeological value of the site. The extreme aridity preserved the dog remains with exceptional completeness. Fur, soft tissue, and skeletal structure survived in conditions that allowed physical characteristics to be assessed with precision. What Guillen observed was a morphological consistency that pointed directly toward a modern breed. The Chiribaya dogs bore a striking resemblance to the Peruvian shepherd dog, also known as the Chiribaya dog, a breed still found in the region today. Her team has been working to establish a formal genetic lineage connecting the ancient cemetery dogs to the modern breed. If confirmed, it would represent an unbroken line of selective breeding and cultural continuity stretching across a millennium. A living dog walking the same coastal terrain as its ancestors, descended from animals that were once buried with blankets and food by people who believed they deserved to be mourned. The cemetery south of Lima holds 43 graves that most surveys would have overlooked, each containing an animal that someone 1,000 years ago decided was worth remembering.